Today's story is Niagara Falls by Mark Twain. First, let us consider a few points that will enrich the listening experience. Mark Twain's Niagara, written around 1871, belongs to the comic travel tradition in which grand scenery is tested against tourists, guides, photographers, shopkeepers, and self-important narrators. The falls remain sublime, but visiting them becomes a theater of salesmanship, danger, vanity, and exaggeration. Listen for the clash between elevated language and blunt anticlimax, the repeated reversal of expectations, and the narrator's cheerful unreliability. The piece also reflects 19th century tourism, when railways, suspension bridges, souvenir shops, and guided attractions turned natural wonder into a commercial itinerary. Now let the story begin. Niagara Falls, written about 1871. Niagara Falls is a most enjoyable place of resort. The hotels are excellent, and the prices are not at all exorbitant. The opportunities for fishing are not surpassed in the country. In fact, they are not even equaled elsewhere. In other localities, certain places in the streams are much better than others, but at Niagara, one place is just as good as another, for the reason that the fish do not bite anywhere. And so there is no use in your walking 5 miles to fish when you can depend on being just as unsuccessful nearer home. The advantages of this state of things have never heretofore been properly placed before the public. The weather is cool in summer, and the walks and drives are all pleasant, and none of them fatiguing. When you start out to do the falls, you first drive down about a mile and pay a small sum for the privilege of looking down from a precipice into the narrowest part of the Niagara River. A railway cut through a hill would be as comely if it had the angry river tumbling and foaming through its bottom. You can descend a staircase here 150 feet and stand at the edge of the water. After you have done it, you will wonder why you did it, but you will then be too late. The guide will explain to you, in his blood-curdling way, how he saw the little steamer, made of the mist, descend the fearful rapids. How first one paddle box was out of sight behind the raging billows, and then the other. At what point her smokestack toppled overboard, where her planking began to break and part asunder, and how she did finally live through the trip, after accomplishing the incredible feat of traveling 17 miles in 6 minutes, or 6 miles in 17 minutes. I have really forgotten which. But it was very extraordinary, anyhow. It is worth the price of admission to hear the guide tell the story 9 times in succession to different parties and never miss a word or alter a sentence or a gesture. Then you drive over to Suspension Bridge and divide your misery between the chances of smashing down 200 feet into the river below and the chances of having the railway train overhead smash down onto you. Either possibility is discomforting when taken by itself, but mixed together, they amount in the aggregate to positive unhappiness. On the Canada side, you drive along the chasm between long ranks of photographers standing guard behind their cameras, ready to make an ostentatious frontispiece of you and your decaying ambulance. And your solemn crate with a hide on it, which you are expected to regard in the light of a horse, with a diminished and unimportant background of sublime Niagara. A great many people have the incredible effrontery or the native depravity to aid and abet this sort of crime. Any day, in the hands of these photographers, you may see stately pictures of Papa and Mama, Johnny and Bub and Sis, or a couple of country cousins, all smiling vacantly, and all disposed in studied and uncomfortable attitudes in their carriage, and all looming up in their awe-inspiring imbecility before the snubbed and diminished presentment of that majestic presence whose ministering spirits are the rainbows, whose voice is the thunder, whose awful front is veiled in clouds, who was monarch here dead and forgotten ages before this sackful of small reptiles was deemed temporarily necessary to fill a crack in the world's unnoted myriads, and who will still be monarch here ages and decades of ages after they shall have gathered themselves to their blood relations, the other worms, and been mingled with the unremembering dust. There is no actual harm in making Niagara a background whereon to display one's marvelous insignificance in a good, strong light. But it requires a sort of superhuman self-complacency to enable one to do it. When you have examined the stupendous Horseshoe Fall till you are satisfied you cannot improve on it, you return to America by the new suspension bridge and follow up the bank to where they exhibit the Cave of the Winds. Here I followed instructions and divested myself of all my clothing and put on a waterproof jacket and overalls. This costume is picturesque, but not beautiful. A guide, similarly dressed, led the way down a flight of winding stairs, which wound and still kept on winding long after the thing ceased to be a novelty, and then terminated long before it had begun to be a pleasure. We were then well down under the precipice, but still considerably above the level of the river. We now began to creep along flimsy bridges of a single plank, our persons shielded from destruction by a crazy wooden railing to which I clung with both hands, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to. Presently the descent became steeper and the bridge flimsier, and spray from the American Fall began to rain down on us in fast increasing sheets that soon became blinding. And after that, our progress was mostly in the nature of groping. Now a furious wind began to rush out from behind the waterfall, which seemed determined to sweep us from the bridge and scatter us on the rocks and among the torrents below. I remarked that I wanted to go home, but it was too late. We were almost under the monstrous wall of water thundering down from above, and speech was in vain in the midst of such a pitiless crash of sound. In another moment the guide disappeared behind the deluge, and, bewildered by the thunder, driven helplessly by the wind, and smitten by the arrowy tempest of rain, I followed. All was darkness. Such a mad storming, roaring, and bellowing of warring wind and water had never crazed my ears before. I bent my head and seemed to receive the Atlantic on my back. The world seemed to be going to destruction. I could not see anything. The flood poured down savagely. I raised my head with open mouth, and most of the American cataract went down my throat. If I had sprung a leak then, I would have been lost. At this moment, I discovered that the bridge had ceased, and that we must trust for a foothold to the slippery and precipitous rocks. I never was so scared before and survived it. But we got through at last and emerged into the open day, where we could stand in front of the laced, frothy, and seething world of descending water and look at it. When I saw how much of it there was, and how fearfully in earnest it was, I was sorry I had gone behind it. The noble red man has always been a friend and darling of mine. I love to read about him in tales and legends and romances. I love to read of his inspired sagacity and his love of the wild, free life of mountain and forest, and his general nobility of character and his stately, metaphorical manner of speech, and his chivalrous love for the dusky maiden and the picturesque pomp of his dress and accoutrements. Especially the picturesque pomp of his dress and accoutrements. When I found the shops at Niagara Falls full of dainty Indian beadwork and stunning moccasins, and equally stunning toy figures representing human beings who carried their weapons in holes bored through their arms and bodies and had feet shaped like a pie, I was filled with emotion. I knew that now, at last, I was going to come face to face with the noble red man. A lady clerk in a shop told me indeed that all her grand array of curiosities was made by the Indians, that they were plentiful about the falls, that they were friendly, and that it would not be dangerous to speak to them. And sure enough, as I approached the bridge leading over to Luna Island, I came upon a noble son of the forest sitting under a tree, diligently at work on a bead reticule. He wore a slouch hat and brogans and had a short black pipe in his mouth. Thus does the baneful contact with our effeminate civilization dilute the picturesque pomp which is so natural to the Indian when far removed from us in his native haunts. I addressed the relic as follows. Is the Wahoo Wang Wang of the Waka Wak happy? Does the great speckled thunder sigh for the warpath, or is his heart contented with dreaming of the dusky maiden, the pride of the forest? Does the mighty sachem yearn to drink the blood of his enemies, or is he satisfied to make bead reticules for the papooses of the paleface? Speak, sublime relic of bygone grandeur, venerable ruin. Speak. The relic said, And is it meself, Dennis Hooligan, that you'd be taken for a dirty Injun, you drawlin', lantern-jawed, spider-legged divil? By the piper that played before Moses, I'll ate ya! I went away from there. By and by, in the neighborhood of the Terrapin Tower, I came upon a gentle daughter of the Aborigines in fringed and beaded buckskin moccasins and leggings, seated on a bench with her pretty wares about her. She had just carved out a wooden chief that had a strong family resemblance to a clothespin and was now boring a hole through his abdomen to put his bow through. I hesitated a moment and then addressed her. Is the heart of the forest maiden heavy? Is the laughing tadpole lonely? Does she mourn over the extinguished council fires of her race and the vanished glory of her ancestors? Or does her sad spirit wander afar toward the hunting grounds, whither her brave gobbler of the lightnings is gone? Why is my daughter silent? Has she aught against the pale-faced stranger? The maiden said, Face, and is it Biddy Malone ye dare to be callin' names? Lave this, or I'll shaw your lean carcass over the cataract, ye snivelling blackguard. I adjourned from there also. Confound these Indians, I said. They told me they were tame, but if appearances go for anything, I should say they were all on the warpath. I made one more attempt to fraternize with them, and only one. I came upon a camp of them gathered in the shade of a great tree, making wampum and moccasins, and addressed them in the language of friendship. Noble red men, braves, grand sachems, war chiefs, squaws, and high muckamucks, the pale face from the land of the setting sun greets you. You, beneficent polecat. You, devourer of mountains. You, roaring thunder gust. You, bully boy with a glass eye. The pale face from beyond the great waters greets you all. War and pestilence have thinned your ranks and destroyed your once proud nation. Poker and 7-Up, and a vain modern expense for soap, unknown to your glorious ancestors, have depleted your purses. Appropriating in your simplicity the property of others has gotten you into trouble. Misrepresenting facts in your simple innocence has damaged your reputation with the soulless usurper. Trading for 40-rod whiskey to enable you to get drunk and happy and tomahawk your families has played the everlasting mischief with the picturesque pomp of your dress. And here you are, in the broad light of the 19th century, gotten up like the ragtag and bobtail of the purlieus of New York. For shame. Remember your ancestors. Recall their mighty deeds. Remember Uncas. And Red Jacket, and Hole in the Day, and Whoop-de-Doodle-Doo. Emulate their achievements. Unfurl yourselves under my banner, noble savages, illustrious gutter snipes. Down with him. Scoop the blackguard. Burn him. Hang him. Drown him. It was the quickest operation that ever was. I simply saw a sudden flash in the air of clubs, brickbats, fists, bead baskets, and moccasins. A single flash, and they all appeared to hit me at once, and no two of them in the same place. In the next instant, the entire tribe was upon me. They tore half the clothes off me. They broke my arms and legs. They gave me a thump that dented the top of my head till it would hold coffee like a saucer. And to crown their disgraceful proceedings and add insult to injury, they threw me over Niagara Falls, and I got wet. About 90 or 100 feet from the top, the remains of my vest caught on a projecting rock, and I was almost drowned before I could get loose. I finally fell and brought up in a world of white foam at the foot of the fall, whose celled and bubbly masses towered up several inches above my head. Of course I got into the eddy. I sailed round and round in it 44 times, chasing a chip and gaining on it, each round trip a half-mile. Reaching for the same bush on the bank 44 times and just exactly missing it by a hair's breadth every time. At last, a man walked down and sat close to that bush, put a pipe in his mouth, lit a match, followed me with one eye, and kept the other on the match while he sheltered it in his hands from the wind. Presently, a puff of wind blew it out. The next time I swept around, he said, "Got a match?" "Yes, in my other vest. Help me out, please." Not for Joe. When I came round again, I said, "Excuse the seemingly impertinent curiosity of a drowning man, but will you explain this singular conduct of yours?" "With pleasure. I am the coroner. Don't hurry on my account. I can wait for you. But I wish I had a match." I said, Take my place, and I'll go and get you one." He declined. This lack of confidence on his part created a coldness between us, and from that time forward, I avoided him. It was my idea, in case anything happened to me, to time the occurrence so as to throw my custom into the hands of the opposition coroner on the American side. At last, a policeman came along and arrested me for disturbing the peace by yelling at people on shore for help. The judge fined me, but I had the advantage of him. My money was with my pantaloons, and my pantaloons were with the Indians. Thus, I escaped. I am now lying in a very critical condition. At least I am lying anyway, critical or not critical. I am hurt all over, but I cannot tell the full extent yet, because the doctor is not done taking inventory. He will make out my manifest this evening. However, thus far, he thinks only 16 of my wounds are fatal. I don't mind the others. Upon regaining my right mind, I said, "It is an awful savage tribe of Indians that does the beadwork and moccasins for Niagara Falls, Doctor. Where were they from?" "Limerick, my son." The reading is followed by a deeper literary commentary. Mark Twain's connection with Niagara Falls belongs to the years when he was closely associated with Buffalo and contributing to the Buffalo Express. Seen within that local and journalistic setting, Niagara was not merely a sublime natural spectacle, but also a modern tourist destination shaped by publicity, travel habits, commercial development, and technological change. Twain's treatment of such places characteristically resists solemn reverence. Instead, he tests the language of tourism against the actual experience of the traveler, exposing the conventions through which celebrated sites are packaged, praised, and consumed. Niagara, therefore, offers an especially fitting subject for his humor, because its overwhelming reputation invites both awe and exaggeration. His comic perspective does not simply dismiss the falls, it reveals the gap between the landscape itself and the expectations produced around it. This tension reflects the broader 19th century transformation of Niagara from a natural wonder into an organized destination served by hotels, railways, guidebooks, viewing facilities, and promotional rhetoric. Twain's Buffalo period placed him near this changing environment and within a newspaper culture alert to local events, public amusements, and the expanding travel economy. Read in that context, his Niagara writing becomes part of a larger inquiry into American tourism, how movement, commerce, technology, and popular taste reshape the meaning of famous places. The humor depends on deflation, but the deeper subject is the modern habit of encountering nature through systems already prepared to tell visitors what they should feel, admire, and remember. Niagara begins as a practical travel recommendation, but every sentence sabotages that promise. The hotels are praised and the fishing declared unsurpassed, only for the narrator to explain that fishing is equally good everywhere, because no fish bite anywhere. This opening establishes Twain's method. Conventional tourist language is accepted for a moment, stretched until its absurdity appears, and then overturned by a deadpan conclusion. The real subject is also the machinery by which travelers consume Niagara as approved sites: admissions, stories, photographs, costumes, dangers, and souvenirs. The itinerary supplies a loose plot. The traveler moves from lookout to staircase, from guide to bridge, from photographers to the Cave of the Winds, and finally toward encounters with supposed indigenous artisans. Each stage raises expectations of sublimity or adventure, then replaces them with discomfort. The staircase produces regret, while the bridge combines two fears into one larger misery. Even the guide's terrifying account of the Maid of the Mist becomes comic because it is repeated word for word to successive parties. Awe becomes a commercial performance, and repetition reveals the mechanism. Yet the falls themselves are not reduced to a joke. Twain grants Niagara genuine majesty, especially when contrasting it with tourist vanity. Photographers arrange families so that stiff poses dominate the picture, while the cataract becomes a diminished background. The narrator's attack is extravagant, but its insight is serious. People visit a power beyond human scale, then try to make it certify their own importance. Niagara's thunder, rainbows, clouds, and immense duration expose the visitors as temporary and trivial. The comedy depends on double vision. Human conduct is ridiculous, while the natural presence before which it occurs remains immense. The Cave of the Winds episode makes the narrator's body the object of comedy. His costume is picturesque, but ugly. The stairs continue beyond novelty and stop before pleasure. And his claim that he grips the railing merely because he wants to converts fear into transparent self-deception. Behind the water, comic understatement gives way to sensory violence. Wind, darkness, thunder, slippery rock, and crushing spray destroy the detached pose of the tourist observer. He cannot frame the cataract as a view because he is engulfed by it. His impossible claim that most of the cataract goes down his throat conveys a real loss of control. Niagara defeats the narrator whenever he tries to master it verbally. The later encounters shift the satire toward fantasy and identity. The narrator professes devotion to the noble red man of romances, but his admiration is assembled from stock images: forest freedom, metaphorical speech, chivalric love, and picturesque dress. He does not approach actual people with curiosity. He approaches figures onto whom he can project literary cliches. His swollen speeches parody frontier romance, while the replies from Dennis Hooligan and Biddy Malone puncture the fantasy with Irish vernacular and threats. The joke turns on mistaken identity, but more deeply on the narrator's refusal to see the workers before him. He prefers a decorative legend because the souvenir trade has promised him one. The comedy also draws upon ethnic caricature and period stereotypes. Twain targets the sentimental consumer who converts indigenous identity into costume and romance, yet the satire remains entangled in 19th century racial and immigrant types. It exposes manufactured authenticity while still simplifying people, a tension central to its historical meaning. After the narrator insults an entire group, the plot becomes an outright tall tale. His injuries are impossible. His fall over the cataract becomes an inconvenience, and the eddy carries him around 44 times with mechanical precision. Exact numbers make the impossible sound documented. The coroner waits for a death that would become his business. The policeman arrests the drowning victim for disturbing the peace. The judge finds a man whose money has vanished with his trousers. Institutions do not restore order. They complete the absurdity by converting catastrophe into jurisdiction, procedure, inventory, and fee. The final revelation that the Indians are from Limerick gathers the themes into one last reversal. The souvenir economy has staged an identity. The narrator has believed the stage more than the people, and his punishment has not corrected him until a doctor supplies the plain fact. Even then, the closing pun on lying preserves his unreliability. He is recumbent, deceptive, and performing his injuries for an audience. Niagara is therefore more than a sequence of jokes about a famous destination. It is a comic study of how travelers arrive with ready-made language, how commerce supplies ready-made experiences, and how reality resists both. The falls endure beyond every pose, sales pitch, romance, photograph, and boast, while the narrator survives mainly as another temporary spectacle. Let us now examine the work through its primary analytical perspective. Twain's Niagara Falls turns a celebrated natural wonder into a test of 19th century habits of seeing. The narrator arrives armed with the language of tourism, improvement, romance, and self-display, only to discover that every institution surrounding the cataract converts sublimity into routine commerce. Guides repeat memorized terrors. Photographers reduce the falls to scenery behind complacent families, and attractions sell danger in regulated portions. The comedy, therefore, depends on a humanistic conflict between the immeasurable scale of nature and the vanity of people who imagine that travel enlarges them. Niagara remains ancient, thunderous, and indifferent, while tourists pose, purchase, boast, and complain. The essay also satirizes the modern faith that experience can be packaged. The narrator does the falls as though completing a social obligation, moving from staircase to bridge, shop, and cave according to an itinerary. His supposed mastery repeatedly collapses into fear, discomfort, and humiliation. Behind the waterfall, language itself becomes useless amid the roar, and the body is reduced to breath, balance, and panic. This scene briefly restores the cataract's power. Nature is not a picture or possession, but an overwhelming material force. Yet Twain refuses solemn transcendence. The narrator swallows the waterfall, worries about leaking, and converts terror into slapstick, exposing how quickly the sublime can be domesticated by comic storytelling. The indigenous episode extends the critique from tourism to culture. The narrator loves an invented, noble red man, assembled from legends, romances, theatrical speech, and decorative commodities. He does not encounter persons. He seeks confirmation of a literary type. The revelation that the supposed beadworkers are Irish immigrants exposes his dependence on costume and cliché. His ornate addresses are acts of symbolic violence because they replace living identities with fantasies convenient to the spectator. At the same time, The episode reflects the period's ethnic caricature and racial vocabulary, so its satire must be read critically. Twain attacks romantic primitivism, but he does so through comic stereotypes that remain historically burdened. The final sequence intensifies the work's distrust of public institutions. The coroner waits for a death. The policeman arrests a drowning man. The judge finds someone without trousers, and the doctor treats the injured body as an inventory. Law, medicine, and civic order become absurd systems that classify suffering rather than relieve it. The closing admission that the narrator is lying gathers the essay's themes into a pun. Travel writing, advertising, legend, photography, and personal testimony all compete to frame Niagara, but none is innocent. Twain's humane insight is that people cannot resist turning reality into stories that flatter their importance. His own extravagant fiction acknowledges that impulse while using laughter to cut it down to size. A second perspective reveals further dimensions of the work. From a folklore studies perspective, Niagara Falls examines how a famous place accumulates stories, stock characters, rituals, and commercial legends. The tourist route resembles a secular pilgrimage. Visitors follow prescribed stations, pay admission, descend stairs, cross bridges, enter the Cave of the Winds, buy curios, and obtain photographs as proofs of encounter. These practices transform Niagara from a geographical site into a shared performance. The guide's account of the Maid of the Mist is especially folkloric. It is an oral narrative, repeated word for word and gesture for gesture to successive audiences. Its uncertain measurements do not weaken its authority, because its purpose is wonder, not accuracy. The narrator also parodies inherited frontier and indigenous motifs. Names such as speckled thunder, references to warpaths, council fires, wampum, and vanished grandeur imitate popular romances rather than authentic tradition. The joke occurs when this pseudo-folklore collides with Irish speech and tourist labor. Beadwork and moccasins become commodities whose alleged authenticity is produced by costume, salesmanship, and expectation. Collective belief manufactures ethnicity as spectacle. The final catastrophe follows tall tale logic. Impossible falls, fatal wounds, bureaucratic cruelty, and survival are reported with calm precision. This combination of absurdity and deadpan delivery belongs to American comic oral tradition, where credibility is stretched until listeners enjoy both the lie and its exposure. The closing pun confirms the narrator as a trickster storyteller whose unreliability is the work's central folk performance. Finally, here are several companion works worth reading. The Innocents Abroad by Mark Twain is the closest companion because it likewise dismantles the conventions of sightseeing, exposing the vanity, rehearsed emotion, and commercial machinery of modern tourism. Roughing It extends Twain's use of tall tale exaggeration, unreliable narration, and comic encounters with regional myths. Washington Irving's The Sketchbook offers an earlier American example of travel, legend, and placemaking, especially where inherited stories shape how landscapes are perceived. Charles Dickens's American Notes provides a useful transatlantic contrast, combining travel observation with satire of public institutions and national self-image. For the critique of romanticized indigenous identity, James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans is especially illuminating. Reading it beside Twain reveals how the elevated noble savage convention could become both culturally powerful and